Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial. Go to audibletrial.com/Rushmore. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Let me just record this in case I want to drop it in. Son of a bitch. Greetings and welcome to the Mount Rushmore podcast. My name is Jeff, and I'm joined, as always, by my good friends Richard.
Hello.
And Michael.
Howdy.
And in addition to Richard and Michael, I have my very good friends Ben and Bob. How you doing, Ben and Bob?
Hey there.
I'm doing awesome. How are you?
Very well, and I'm very glad that you are here to break up the monotony of my ongoing conversations with these losers, Richard and Michael.
What?
Bob and Ben are here with us to debate the Mount Rushmore of horror comedy, and you gentlemen are now sharing out the season 2 of your horror comedy series. Tell me about that.
Okay, it's called 20 Seconds to Live. It's a web series, and it's very short anthology episodes. Every episode, different characters. At some point, a timer comes up, counts down from 20 to 0. By the time it gets to 0, somebody dies.
Yeah, and there's kind of a game to it. Like, you know, we've learned after doing it for a while that the trick is to make sure that you either want everybody to die or you want nobody to die. And so as an audience, as soon as that title card comes up, you're like, one of these people's going to die, and how. And we're also proud to say no one's ever died by gunshot yet. So, it's always something a little bit, hopefully, more creative.
Ben, you're currently editing season 2. How's that been going, Ben?
Oh, it's a lot of fun, but it's when we did the first season, it was like kind of piecemeal. We would just do one episode and then a couple episodes, and this it's like the whole season all at once. And so I feel like a full-time TV editor right now, just chopping away at this stuff.
Ben's not only an editor but also cinematographer, and one of the some of the provenance of his career has to do with being involved with a horror film from way back. What was that?
That was the Blair Witch Project. I was the production designer on it, and I also wrote most of the backstory.
Well, that's cool. And if Ben wrote some of the backstory, Bob, you're a writer. Was that your role in this production?
I co-created the show with Ben and wrote almost all the scripts. Ben and I co-wrote 2 of them.
Yeah.
And I've been a working screenwriter in over a decade now.
Yeah, so Bob has had some big films out there and some really cool indies. Will you let people know what they are?
Oh, yeah, I wrote Killers with Ashton Kutcher and Katherine Heigl that came out a few years ago, and then the big indie drama, The Air I Breathe, which I co-wrote with the director Ji-Ho Lee. And before 20 Seconds to Live, I was a writer on the USA TV show White Collar.
Cool. Well, I have seen all of this web series. I enjoy it very much. 20 Seconds to Live, 20secondstolive.com or 20STL on Twitter is where you can find more information. The second season is coming out in a couple months. Unlike this podcast, which is long-winded and sometimes not action-packed at all or even interesting, theirs is concise, entertaining, engaging for fans of horror, for fans of comedy. You're going to find that you're binging both seasons of the series because you're going to love it. So go ahead.
Jeff, I don't know how to tell you this.
What's that?
But there's a timer over your head.
Oh, shit.
Oh, no.
Right
Oh,
now.
my God.
Good news, it's like 35 years, so you're okay.
35 years to live.
Not quite as exciting.
The topic that we've chosen specifically to get these guys' amazing opinions on is the Mount Rushmore of horror comedy. And as a child, I was more into comedy, and then as growing into an adulthood and getting a better taste for horror, found myself gravitating to horror comedy versus just straight horror, because it was straight horror is maybe just a little too rich for my blood. But I am fascinated to get your opinion on the similarities between horror and comedy. When I was studying comedy, they kind of describe it as the creation and release of tension and dealing with expectations and things like that. Is there anything that you find similar about the genre of horror
Totally.
comedy?
I think that they both rely on surprise. I mean, surprise is at the core of it, and I always think the hardest thing to do is a dark comedy, and horror comedy is, I would say, kind of a subset of dark comedy.
Yeah.
Because you run the risk of being too morbid, you'll undermine the comedy. If you're too jokey, then it's not scary. And the ones that do it right, and these are the ones that I think we've chosen, are to me the ones where you can have the comedy, you can have the horror, and they both work together. I kind of feel like the DNA of it starts with Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolfman.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like Abbott and Costello are Abbott and Costello, but the monsters, the Universal monsters, are all actually scary.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was actually looking up, that might have been one of our choices, but I was looking up, and it was just like the most famous of like those types of movies. I guess they had other movies that were similar beforehand. They had like knockoff characters of Abbott and Costello that met zombies before Abbott and Costello met
Like the mummy.
Frankenstein's monster. And it reminded me of a few episodes ago when we recorded, or last year when we did Halloween songs. And I went into it thinking that the Monster Mash was like the first monster related, but it wasn't. It just capitalized on a trend later on. But I think movies like that tend to, when something is so successful, it becomes like the pinnacle or the end all, and you're like, oh, this is where it came from. But it kind of built to there and then built from there.
Yeah.
But and I have to give Steve Barton, the publisher of Dread Central, credit for kind of pointing me to this. But it's movies like that when they do it right. The comedic characters are funny, but the situations are real. Like
right.
and you have to keep the stakes very real, and it's very, very hard to do. And we could probably, like, I could come up with 20 Mount Rushmores of failed horror comedies,
Sure.
where they were trying to be too scary and it wasn't funny at all, or more often they were like goofy parodies.
That's interesting.
And there's also movies that are they're just straight up horror movies that have funny stuff in them. We debated a lot of movies, and I'm sure that it's going to come up with, like, what is a horror comedy? Is it just a scary movie that has some laughs, or is it its own thing?
I was IMing with Richard, and I said, is Freddy Krueger funny, or does he just make like shitty puns that like he thinks is funny?
And I think we came down to it's a horror movie that has comedic elements, but there's something different between that and an actual horror comedy.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to jump right in. Gentlemen, you are our guests, and so you have the first choice. So if one of you would like to let us know what you're going to go with first.
All right, we're going to start with Return to the Living Dead, which in 1985, it's probably my favorite horror comedy. Has anybody seen it?
Yes.
You've seen it?
I
Okay,
have seen
good.
it.
Is that the one in the mall?
No.
Okay.
Okay. This is the one. It's.
I've seen a few of them, but I can't remember.
The one in the mall is Dawn of the Dead.
Thank you.
Which we
Okay,
will get
Right.
to.
So Return to the Living Dead, the conceit is that Night of the Living Dead actually happened, and the government took all the zombies and put them in these canisters, and they ended up at the bottom of this medical supply company. And so these bumbling guys accidentally open it, releases the chemical into the air, and this chemical makes everything that's dead alive. So like the half dogs and the butterflies, and there's a cadaver there that they have to then kill, and they chop up and they burn in the incinerator at this funeral home, which then puts smoke up into the air with the chemical that then rains onto the nearby graveyard.
Wait a second. Sean Hannity just said last night that this was the result of the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
But you're saying this is a movie.
It's a
The
movie.
original
Oh
title.
my God.
The original title was "Thanks Obamacare,"
Thanks,
and nobody
Obama.
got it.
So basically, all these zombies come to life, and there happens to be like punk rockers partying in the graveyard,
Including Linnea Quigley.
Linnea Quigley as Trash, the punk rocker who just has strip teases for no reason.
Because she's Linnea Quigley.
In a
She's
graveyard.
Linnea Quigley.
Yeah.
But it's actually a really good zombie siege movie when these punk rockers have to team up with these medical supply workers. So it's like, at its heart, it's a really good zombie movie. It's kind of groundbreaking. You brought up some points about the zombie rules.
One of the first running zombie movies that I've ever seen, and also, and somebody can correct me if
Sorry, that means not slow zombies.
yes,
Fast
okay.
zombies.
These zombies, like an ambulance pulls up and they swarm it immediately.
Yeah.
And they talk. And as far as I know, this is the first zombie movie that ever has zombies craving brains specifically.
Oh, okay.
Like before then, like the George Romero zombies, they just eat you and pull out your guts and whatever. This one, they wanted to eat brains, and they even interrogate like a half a woman monster who's like strapped down to a table, and she talks about how eating the brains takes away the pain of being dead.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. Why this versus another? It sounds like clearly there's some innovations that happened or expanded on the zombie lore, but why this version?
For me, the tone is exactly right on for a horror comedy. It works as a horror movie. You took out the comedy stuff. It's a great zombie siege movie that's really inventive and cool and different, but it's also super funny. It's got a killer soundtrack. It's like that mid-'80s like sweet spot. And you'll see most of our movies are from the mid-'80s. I think those were, for me, that was kind of the dream time of horror comedies. But this movie just rocks. And it's like, I think another thing when we talked about the idea of like horror and comedy as genres, we forget about the crowd experience. Both those movies separately have amazing experiences. You want to see them with a crowd of people. When you put together an excellent horror comedy, seeing it with a crowd is just like religious experience. And this movie itself, I saw it in the theater as a kid, and it just killed.
That's definitely something that I haven't really experienced lately. Like I don't go to a lot of horror movies, and I don't really see any
You
movies.
go to movies
I
full
don't-
stop.
I
You
don't-
have
I
a
don't see
newborn. You have a
movies
new kid, not newborn.
anywhere
but
with
new kid.
an 8-month-old. But like, whenever they'd show like a trailer for a movie, like on TV, a commercial, like, oh, this is the new, whatever, some baby crawling on the ceiling movie that's filmed in black and white and cost $40,000 to make, and I can't. What's the name of that? Paranormal Activity, something like that, where like they always show like the audience reacting. They have like that hidden camera in the front, and it's always like all those screams and all those jumps. It's like I can't remember the last time I've been to a movie that physically I like leapt out of my seat. So I'm excited to see something like this.
Yeah.
Well,
in a theater that I'll never get a chance to do.
It'll probably play it like the New Beverly or something. But like also to what you were saying, Jeff, I think that this movie also is hysterically funny, and it's for the exact Abbott and Costello-ness of all the characters. You know, you start with this young guy and this old guy in this medical supply warehouse. The first shot of the movie, it says like there's a title card that comes up that says the names and institutions in this movie are real or something like that. Like basically, and then the first shot is the side of a building and it says you need a medical supply. You know, and then you go into it and it's like this crusty old guy played by James Cameron. He's hilarious. I forget the actor who plays the young guy, but it's like he's showing him the ropes, and it's just so goddamn funny. The first thing that you see when they release the zombie goo is these split dog models that are like made from real dogs for veterinarians in training, and they're barking. And it's just a funny visual, you know. Like to me, this movie has as many laughs as it has scares, and the punk rockers like perfectly encapsulate what I think punk rockers were like back then. In a way, it's not like well thought out punk rockers. It's assholes who want to hang out in a graveyard in the middle of the night and have one of their girlfriends strip on a mausoleum. And right down the line. And it also features like legendary Clu Gulager, who's just an amazing character actor, and he is hilarious in this movie because he's like the only one who's like, "Are you guys complete idiots?" But he's also the one who like puts the original zombie into the crematorium and ends up. And I don't want to ruin the end for people who haven't seen it, but the end is an amazing punchline.
Yeah, this is on the Rushmore, I think, of the 80s punk rockers do X sort of like movies, like the Surf Nazis Must Die. There's a whole genre of these movies.
Wraith.
Yeah, there's a whole genre of these movies where
Most of them were police academies.
maybe a police academy where there's a genre type film, and it's like, well, what do we need to do to make this kind of current and hit? I know, we'll throw in really bad Black Flag impersonators.
Yeah.
Like the extras from that Chips episode of punk rock.
Yeah.
Basically.
When there was a Punisher reboot with the guy from Rome, and he's been in I forget his name.
Yeah, Punisher 2.
Ray
Stevenson?
Ray Stevenson.
Yeah.
And they had parkour. He was out trying to stop a parkour gang. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
come
That's
on.
awesome.
It's like The Office when it was like 6 years ago. They had a parkour episode 6 years ago.
When we're done here, you
Parkour
guys
was
want to go form a
interesting.
parkour gang? I'd love to do that.
Oh, we were so qualified. I'm looking around the room right now.
I see a lot of parkour in this house.
Comedy has an opportunity to create social satire and social commentary. And I remember it was that George Romero was talking about the zombie films as having that opportunity to show the society that we live, the challenges of society that we live, because there's often haves and have-nots, and when an epidemic like this happens, you see how it becomes politicized and how people who have a bunch of money are able to evade for a while this menace, but they're not always able to.
And this, correct me if I'm wrong, this is not a George Romero film. There's like a split there, right?
Yes.
The lineage.
It's John Russo and George Romero. So John Russo and George Romero both created Night of the Living Dead, and then they had a professional falling out. I think they were still friends, but John Russo kept the rights to Living Dead, and George Romero kept the rights to Of the Dead. So the George Romero movies are Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Survival of the Dead, blah blah blah. And then somehow John Russo didn't make this movie. He ended up getting the rights of it.
I think he's got story credit, actually, on this movie.
Oh, because Dan O'Bannon wrote and directed it, and
Right.
Dan O'Bannon wrote Alien.
Yeah, Dan O'Bannon's a huge screenwriter. I mean, he passed away, but he wrote a lot of classic stuff. And this was one of the only movies he directed.
I'm not sure if he ever directed another movie
There's
after
one
this.
more movie after this I've never... It's a Lovecraft
You mentioned if
adaptation.
George Michael said, "I'll take Wham," and Andrew Ridgeley, you can have the exclamation mark at the end of the word. Oh, thanks. So, guys, they came out swinging. What do you got?
All right, so we were almost going to do categories this week, and then the last one kind of fell apart.
Yeah, so don't even.
So I'm not even mentioning it.
Okay.
Thanks for nothing, Richard. This is something we were going to do, but then we didn't do. So
What I'm here for.
yeah.
So first one we're doing, sticking on the zombie film tip, Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, fun.
Speaking of George Romero, this was clearly...
Speaking of great soundtracks.
Also speaking of great soundtracks, yes. Clearly inspired by Dawn of the Dead. Originally, actually, the genesis of it came from Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright's British TV show, Spaced.
Oh, okay.
They did an episode where Simon Pegg's character, Tim, winds up taking amphetamines to stay up all night to play video games and winds up hallucinating that there's a zombie apocalypse and he has to stop it. And when they did that, Edgar Wright realized, oh, we both love George Romero films. We should maybe try and do something with this. Came up with a script outline that was originally called Tea Time of the Dead. Not tea time as in golf, but actual like drinking tea. And just sort of went from there. And that's where the Three Cornettos trilogies begin. But I love this film. This is my favorite horror comedy movie of all time. And I think what you guys talked about earlier, where a film has to have the right balance between horror and comedy. I mean, this is one that certainly leans more on the comedy, I think, more than the horror. But when they do a horror piece, like some of the set pieces, they actually work. Like this would be one that would be easy to get really wrong. And I think that's true of a lot of any of these horror comedy films that are, let's say, satires of the genre or inspired by the genre. If you don't have a love for that genre itself, if you just say, oh, well, we have an idea to make a funny zombie film. I don't really love zombie films, but this would be a funny idea. Ha, ha, ha. You're not going to get the zombie part right, and it's not going to read as authentic. And there's a clear love of the Romero zombie films, the Italian zombie films, some of that other stuff that you can see is being brought into here. And to me, I think it's just the perfect balance of the two.
I saw it in the theaters, but have viewed it on at home a bunch of times. I don't recall. Were you ever afraid when you saw it? Or were you ever grossed out or whatever those things you need?
there's definitely the gross out part where there's a few scenes where people are getting like disemboweled by packs of zombies and arms getting ripped off and such.
I do remember thinking that these characters were in peril and that the danger is real. But I don't ever remember being unlike some other films like, oh shit, that was a jump scare. I'm really frightened by
There are a couple of scenes in like when they're kind of stuck in the car and his stepfather, I can't remember his name. I should remember his name.
Bill Nighy.
Yeah, Bill Nighy is turning into a zombie like in the moment that they're in the car together, and he kind of turns over his shoulder and realizes that 2 seconds ago he was a human being, and then like he's in there fighting him off at that moment. And it's frightening.
And there's a real tension in that kind of later scene when they're back in the Winchester and they realize it's all kind of going wrong, and his mom's turning into a zombie, and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah,
that's like there's some real actual drama and tension there.
Yeah, for sure, that's one of the
earned.
Scenes, I always think of that scene in particular when I think about the movie, because to me, I think that's when I light up because it felt really scary.
Right, and it felt earned too.
Yeah,
because you felt like you knew the characters well enough, and it felt like even though they were comedy characters, you felt like you had enough of a sense of who they really were, so that when they do get in trouble and there's this peril, and there's a sense of hopelessness, you actually start to feel that, which if the rest of the movie wouldn't have been handled as well as it was, that wouldn't have mattered.
I think Edgar Wright seems to have a kind of like Quentin Tarantino-esque sort of knowledge of other movies, of like past movies, that kind of has allowed him to build like the Cornetto movies based on other genres, to kind of take bits and pieces and make homages to other things and do it in a way that's very clever without being he doesn't overplay his hand. He takes just enough reference to be like, oh, this is a nod to this. It's tongue in cheek, and without it being like a full bow to something, or to take a shot directly and be like, this is exactly what this is. Just kind of refilmed.
Yeah, and
it's pretty interesting.
I think it's interesting, and I think also like Tarantino, he makes it look easy. So I think he makes people I think other filmmakers look at his stuff and go, well, I can do that. So I feel like Shaun of the Dead is usually, so many filmmakers are like, I'm making a movie that's X meets Shaun of the Dead. And that's the one thing that bums me out about it, is it's created this whole generation of filmmakers that go, I can do that because he knocked it out of the park first time. And I'm like, because it's so hard. And you're right, it's a fantastic film, and he nails the tone of it. And and
it was definitely one of the ones that we debated.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you mentioned how he makes it look easy. I mentioned Space. I mean, that's pretty much whatever is 3 British TV seasons of nothing but genre parodies or genre takes stacked on top of them, stacked oftentimes multiple ones in each episode. So it was the perfect training ground for them to be able to figure out, okay, how do we actually take something and make it that's an homage to something, but also kind of make it our own, which I think is where a lot of those type of rip-off type movies kind of get lost.
Well, yeah, I think that like to do a proper homage, like if you'd never seen a zombie movie and Shaun of the Dead was the first zombie movie you ever saw, you would have no problem following it. You might miss some of the references it was making, but it's self-contained. And to me, I always hate it when I go to see something, I mean, unless it's a sequel to something else, obviously, but I hate it when I go see something where it's like I have to walk in with like my knowledge of whatever it is. I have to build the world for the filmmaker, and what Edgar Wright is brilliant at doing, and he does it in every film he does, is he builds the complete world for us, the viewer, and we don't need anything but that movie.
You guys are working on season 2 of your show.
Yeah, we already shot it, actually.
Oh, I think Bob, before you came in, said you were working on like editing furiously. Do you guys how often or how frequently do you kind of reference other horror comedies or horror films or comedies and just like, this is what we're trying to go for, but we don't want exactly. We just want a piece, and we want someone to be like, I know that reference. I know that thing.
Well, the nice thing about our show is it's an anthology show, so every episode Ben's already said it's always like playing in a big sandbox. So each episode can be its own corner of the horror universe. So like one of my favorite episodes from season 1 is called Evil Doll. And guy comes over to the house, knocks on the door, girl pulls him in. It's like, hey, there's this doll that was on the shelf. Now it's standing on the floor. And it's like a big, dramatic, scary reveal, like, dun-dun, there's the doll. And the guy's like, so what? Did it just fly? And it's like, what would you do if an actual evil doll showed up? And he kicks it out the window. And the thing is like, if you've seen evil doll movies, then you can think like, yeah, what would you do if that doll was just standing there? Probably something like kick it out the window. But also, if you've never seen an evil doll movie, I think it still works. So it allows us to like grab a certain like subgenre of horror and play with it in our show.
Well, and we did something on that episode too that is like an in-joke to an in-joke, which is that there's a cameo in it, and the cameo is played by Tom Holland, the guy who directed Child's Play.
Oh, the original Chucky movie.
Sure.
Yeah.
One thing that strikes me about comedy horror as a genre is that it seems to obey much of the rules of comedy, but has raised the stakes. Most comedies are predicated on the fact that the cast isn't all going to die. So that is not true. with
we only have one episode where the whole cast dies, just to be
clear.
Really?
Okay. So Shaun of the Dead is your guys' pick. Ben and Bob, what do you got?
Our next pick is the Stuart Gordon classic Re-Animator.
Wow. So the guitarist from the Police and Sting from the Police married, had a baby.
And its name was Re-Animator.
I thought they hated each other.
Sumner.
You just completely short-circuited my brain.
Okay.
So Stuart Gordon, I think, reinvigorated the long fallow career of H.P. Lovecraft, whose work had been kind of lying around, not as appreciated as it could have been.
It was just laying dormant, that's all.
Yeah, dreaming.
It's right.
In its castle under the sea. No, but he tackled Re-Animator, which is a very short H.P. Lovecraft short story, and he modernized it. It stars Jeffrey Combs, and it's bananas. It's one of the craziest fucking movies of its period. And right down to the Dr. Hill character at one point. So the basic pitch of the movie is that this genius medical school student has made this glowing green goo that can bring the dead back to life, but they come back kind of monkey's pawed, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Like they're a little goofy, they're a little violent, they're a little horrible. They're not really zombies, but they're just super violent and kind of mentally stunted from the process of having been dead. And it's sort of just one of those movies where the character just keeps doubling down on knowing that he's a genius, and he's getting closer and he's getting closer, and leaving a trail of bodies in his wake, which he then reanimates, and then more and more horrible things happen with each body. And so, like Barbara Crampton plays his love interest. He accidentally kills her father, who's like the provost or something at the university, reanimates him, and then he's like drooling and crazy and violent.
Yeah, like a provost.
And probably one of the best known parts of it is like one of the he has a teacher who's super jealous of him, Dr. Hill, and he tries to take away his reagent, and he ends up killing him and cutting off his head, and his head gets reanimated, and then his body gets reanimated, and so you have a body being controlled by the head, walking around holding the head like in a pan, and there's even a scene where he ties down. He ties down Barbara Crampton and performs cunnilingus on her with the head. And to get that level of visual pun in there is it's pretty impressive. And I mean the movie is genuinely freaky. I saw it when I was a kid on VHS and it freaked me out. Yeah. But the older I got, the more I realized it's unbelievably hilarious. There's a scene where they reanimate a cat early on, and it's hilariously ridiculous. Bob, do you have anything to add?
As an asterisk, I mean, Stuart Gordon lives and works in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And he's actually become a really successful theater director. So he actually took Re-Animator and turned it into a stage musical. And it was called Re-Animator the Musical, and it played multiple theaters, multiple runs in Los Angeles and Vegas. And the funny thing is, like, it's a hilarious, awesome show, and yet it's really just Re-Animator the movie with musical numbers. He didn't have to necessarily add that many jokes. I mean, it works just as a horror comedy in whatever medium it is.
Yeah.
I think that's really hard to pull off.
Well, and I think that's one of the things about Stuart Gordon is that all of his work, even his most serious work, he has such a sense of humor, and it comes through in his work. And so he followed this up with another H.P. Lovecraft adaptation called From Beyond, and it's even more bananas in a bunch of ways and stars a bunch of the same people, but it's also really, really funny. But I mean, it's like he finds this weird, surreal, dark, funny irony in life. And in the case of Re-Animator, which was kind of a low budget horror movie even at its time, like I'd say that both the horror and the comedy are about as ramped up as they can possibly be.
Would you say this is Cocaine writes a movie, or is it?
No.
Why is it so wild and crazy? Is the original source?
It's very
content like
surrealistic, and I don't know if that's what they were going for, but it's got this Winnell sort of like slicing up eyeballs, kind of like, like
There is a bit of
bizarre visual quality to it. So I don't know if that has something to do with it.
I should do a little bit of full disclosure. Both Bob and I know Stuart reasonably well, and
he's getting a kickback from this episode.
Yeah. Stuart's getting enjoy your money, Stuart. But but it's like Stuart is just like an outrageously smart guy with just his brain is always going a million miles a minute, and he's a provocateur, I think, above everything else. And I think that when he's making a movie like Re-Animator, he's thinking of things that are provocative. But I also am like reanimating the cat or the cunnilingus scene, where I'm sure that it cracked everybody up to do it because it's so fucking weird and goofy. Yeah. But at the same time, like when you stop and think, it's a reanimated headless body holding a reanimated bodiless head performing a sex act, and they would just find funny. I don't think it's Cocaine writes a movie. I don't know if they were. I'm sure everybody was doing cocaine back then, but they were all theater people. They founded the Organic Theater in Chicago. And that's where I think most of these people came from. And I just think that they had a shorthand, and they would come up with shit that would make them laugh. So you know, like when Dr. Hill's head needs to be set straight up, and they kind of put it on one of those receipt spikes or whatever. Yeah. Like they're doing stuff that had to be cracking them up. Like they're just all smart, funny people.
Okay. Yeah. The lack of creativity that has existed in some horror films, I think reveals the lack of ambition that people have within that genre. They just think horror is reduced to jump scares and gore, and that's all one need to do to fill the needs of the audience.
Well, who's the science fiction writer who said that 90% of everything is crap? I mean, I think that, horror movies don't escape that. Yeah. There's a lot of bad horror movies, but there's a lot of bad movies,
And that's why I was glad that we tackled the horror comedy today, because I think that in particular as a genre is so hard to get right, and people love them so much that there's all the ones that we're talking about are stone cold classics, because there's just not that many good ones. So
True.
And this has become like a little cottage industry unto itself, right? There's like the sequels.
Right.
There was a musical that played at somewhere in Hollywood.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
may
that's the one I was talking about,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's still playing, right?
I think they just they played maybe last year, but I think,
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Is
they
that
took,
just-
it, they took it to Vegas.
Did they do the Vegas show? They did it at the
Right.
Wynn for a while, I believe. Broadway, off Broadway, off Broadway.
I don't think they ever took it to Broadway.
You're
No,
thinking
I
of
just-
Re-Animator.
Oh, dang it! Yeah.
Sorry.
He's been sitting on that one for like
Yeah.
We
7
should make
minutes.
Re-Animator. Oh my God! Why are we
Re-Animator.
still sitting here doing a podcast? We need to go make a
Podcast
zombie
over.
Annie movie.
She
Can we
does
drop
have like
5
that
mics
kind
in
of
the
those blank dead eyes in the
She
comic
did.
strip anyway.
So did Daddy
Maybe she-
Warbucks.
Maybe she
wanna
was a zombie.
You don't want to know what they do with the dog. You just don't. No, I didn't realize that when you brought this up. I looked up Stuart Gordon.
Yeah.
He wrote "Honey, I Shrunk the
He
Kids."
sure
Indeed, he did.
Whoa,
Yeah.
that's a bit of a tonal shift.
he made Robot Jocks. He's like even though he's known
I
as a
have I have a
Uh-oh.
I've never
great
even seen
story
it.
about
Oh, do
Robot
you?
Jocks.
We need your Robot Jock story instead of Stuart.
I was like a teenager, and my stepdad Morgan, who I've mentioned on the show a couple of times.
Hey, Morgan.
We'd go see movies all the time, and be weird kind of movies that I was probably too young to go see, that I can't, that I've either blocked out of my head. One time we went to go see Leprechaun.
Oh yeah.
Nice. I want me gold.
We walked out of that movie because he didn't like it. A movie that we sat all the way through. We drove over to like Santa Monica to see it. Was Robot Jocks, and like it's like, no offense, it's kind of super bad, kind of awful, but like
I'm not agreeing with the Stuart if you're hearing this podcast.
Don't worry about that. But like, it's just one of those movies that like I feel like I'm one of 4 people that have seen, and it was just like, oh, this is.
You're also a kid, so maybe it went over your head a little.
I don't know.
bit.
It's like, how did we sit through all of this, but then the guy was getting pogo stick to death in Leprechaun, and that was like
Over the top.
that
too
was
much.
that wasn't good enough. Like that was too bad to.
Well,
to
you and I
watch.
have something in common because I also saw Robot Jocks in the theater.
All
Two of the
right.
4. My Re-Animator story is I remember being a kid, like in junior high, and going to the local like back in the day, kids, we actually had to rent these VHS things, and I remember seeing the cover for this and just thinking, this looks absolutely fucking bonkers. The cover itself was just like crazy. If I remember, it's got like the main character like it's doing like almost like the Frankenstein with the head. It was just this thing, and as I got a little bit older, I realized one of my friends owned his family owned a video store, so we could get whatever.
The Holy Grail, man.
Oh man, I watched so many movies through that, and that was one where it was like we grabbed it, but it turned out it was the R-rated version.
Yeah.
So like, there's all these scenes that I don't know because they wound up. I found out years later they were had an R-rated version, then an unrated version.
The holding of the head sex act was actually from the N-rated version.
Yeah,
That wasn't
so
in-
when you
yeah.
said that, I'd never heard that before because that's what I remember as a kid is the R-rated.
How could they
version.
cut that out?
because it made it X back in the day, so they had
don't
to release it
see
R-rated.
anything.
Yeah, there's a
You just see a headless body holding a head between a beautiful woman's legs.
Ben is also a certified daycare provider too. So if you,
I'd like to see the negotiations that went on that
Yeah.
one, whether or not. So, can we have 2 seconds of the head down there, or how many seconds can we get it, and we still get an R?
I think the MPAA was somewhat weaponized in the 80s. Like, I remember Phantasm 2 cut one of the death scenes frame for frame like Phantasm, the original, and they got an X rating and they had to go back.
It's hilarious.
all right, Richard and Michael.
Okay, talking about movies that go from like a hard R X rating to a PG-13 rating, we're going to talk about 1984's Gremlins.
Okay.
Which directed by Joe Dante, who's done a whole bunch of other like horror films. He directed The Howling and Piranha, and another one that we almost chose was The Burbs.
Right.
For a while, we were trying to shoehorn in, these different categories, and you're like, there's not a lot of good like serial killer slasher movies that are comedies that aren't like what was the knockoff of Scream?
Scary movie.
Scary Movie. Like it was just like everything's kind
That's
of
a
like
parody, though.
yeah.
I mean, Scream is almost a horror comedy. We could debate that.
We debated it. We almost chose
Yeah,
it. but
We almost
didn't.
chose it. I think Scream has one of the best horror comedy moments ever, but we can talk about that later.
But Gremlins is one of those movies that has just enough of like that kind of, Spielbergian magic, Twilight twinkle to it, but then is also kind of filled with like a family-friendly cartoon plush character that you can see stuck on the window of your car. And then these genuine like kind of thrills and kind of terror sequences where these horrible green monsters are attacking this town. And I think the one that really jumped out for me was the mother of the household is kind of like walking around the house. And she knows something's wrong, and she's kind of creeping down the stairs, and then she's creeping past like the Christmas tree, and like you just see like these little eyes light up like Christmas lights, and a Christmas tree attacks her, and she has to fight it off with like swords, and she she destroys these things in like in the microwave and the blender, and it's so gory and like gruesome, but also cartoonish, and like there's the blood is green and it explodes, so that, like there's enough there that as a horror movie and as kind of like a thriller, and then there's the super cute stuff with Howie Mandel squeaking around as Gizmo.
Far as like that death with the Gremlins in a microwave, right?
Yeah, they did one in the microwave, and
it came out the same summer as Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Right.
And that also had like the heart ripping, and because of both of those movies, that's why they created PG-13.
Right.
Which is like we just got to finally draw the line somewhere. So Gremlins does have a place in.
It's interesting that they dinged Spielberg twice.
Yeah.
In the same summer for like you're taking it too far.
He's pushing the envelope, Spielberg. Come on, man.
Noted horror comedy master, Steven Spielberg.
Wasn't he also going through an ugly divorce right then? Is that what I think hearing that led to some of the darkness?
Heart was being ripped out.
He was thinking
It's a little,
about putting,
little on the nose.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting he was thinking about putting Amy Irvin in
the microwave?
Yeah.
But there are like just some like the movie is genuinely funny with a lot of like the comedy around like his parents and his dad is like this kind of hapless inventor, and it starts to get a little bit more broad with the Gremlins just being these terrifying little monsters, and then they're just at a bar drinking.
Yeah.
And like flashing everybody. And you're like, what are these things?
They're surly teenagers.
Yeah. How do they adopt all like these mannerisms within like 5 minutes of screen time, and they're flashing everyone? They're like just these little amazing creatures. I just love this movie, and Gremlins 2 certainly took it to a whole new level of parody.
I don't know who does this, but there's a Twitter feed called the Institute of Gremlins 2 Studies, which you should definitely check out.
All right, so does that bring us to our
I think
halftime?
we're at halftime.
Okay, cool. So
Of the big game.
Which I cannot,
like legally say anything else.
want to thank the guys, the creators of 20 Seconds to Live, Ben Rock and Bob DeRosa, for being here. You can find more information about their series now in its second season, currently being edited, at 20 Seconds to Live with a 2 and a 0 at the front, or at 20STL on Twitter. We are at our halftime, and I want to implore you to support the Mount Rushmore podcast by download, rating, and reviewing our podcast on Stitcher and iTunes. We really would like your feedback, so please, if you have the opportunity, leave a comment on what you think of the podcast, and would love a 5-star review. And then another place to join the dialogue with the Mount Rushmore podcast is our Facebook page. You can go up there and suggest topics. You could comment on topics you've heard. You can join the dialogue. You could do the same thing on our Twitter and our Instagram handles.
And if you have a good French onion soup recipe,
Yes.
we'd love to have
Or
it.
chowder, maybe, if you want to.
All good.
Yeah. And we would love to talk with you in our social media world. And we'd also love to offer you, listeners of the Mount Rushmore podcast, a free audiobook download and a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out these peeps named Audible. Audible is an awesome organization, and they're one of our sponsors. And I'm telling you that there is such an opportunity to go on there and find something you like. You might want Turning Face, A Tale of Horror, Comedy, and Wrestling, the Audible audio edition by Todd Curlis. I've not heard this. It's just the first thing that came up when I searched Audible horror and comedy. This is how little planning I do. But, there's 180,000 titles to choose from, so you're going to find something that you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And this is a free 30-day trial, and it helps us out when you go to audibletrial.com/Rushmore. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Rushmore for your free audiobook. We are also
just don't go after midnight.
You know what you can do?
Because you don't know what it turns into.
Or don't eat. What they could do on Audible, they do have dramatizations of Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, etc., etc.
Oh my gosh, that's
So
perfect.
you should probably go do that.
Definitely do that. And we're back. This is the back half of our discussion of the Mount Rushmore of comedy and horror genre. And I need to reveal something. You guys have seen this bloody bag that I've had?
I was wondering about that.
Yeah, the blood dripping from it. Well, it's the special bloody edition of the Borglum bag, which is the repository that I have for my judge pick. And my judge pick is something that I know you guys probably considered. I know you guys probably thought of it. But it was, for me, the epitome of horror comedy when I was a teenager. And I probably saw it way too soon, and it scarred me as an adult. And that is the American Werewolf in London. And as a big fan of comedy and John Landis, I was so kind of destroyed when he went into this horror direction, but was amazed at his ability to spring me back and forth between the two genres and do them both so effectively. Also, while creating these two characters using David Naughton, the Dr. Pepper guy, and Griffin Dunn as his sidekick, two characters that I wanted to hang around with and pal around Europe together and see the world through. So that was a huge influence on me. And the first movie I ever saw that had a dream sequence inside of a dream sequence.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
So that's in the bag, and I can open this bloody bag at any point during the judging portion of this show and use it to trump one of your great choices. And who knows, I might do that. The suspense is killing us.
One of the things about, also another movie, I should say, that has a great soundtrack.
Oh,
There
yeah.
seems to be something
yes.
about comedy horror movies that
Yeah.
bring out the best in whoever is making the soundtrack.
Yes. I think he almost took the Scorsese approach. If in Mean Streets or Taxi Driver or even Goodfellas, you see gruesome things happening while popular music plays.
Right.
Yeah. So
But in the case of American Werewolf in London, it's covers of Blue Moon except for Moondance.
is that right?
There's
It's
there's like 4 covers of Blue Moon in that movie. It comes in with like I don't know who the singer is, but the original like 1950s
The
one.
Marcells,
and
yes.
then it goes out. It ends with a bomb ba bomb ba dang dang dang. It ends with that one. But then during the love scene, Moondance plays.
yeah. So I
But
think,
there's even like a jazzier version of Blue Moon that
Is that
plays
right?
when he's transforming the first time.
There's Bad Moon Rising.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Moon, yeah.
Comedic effect.
My bad.
the choice of Shaun of the Dead maybe but planted this in my mind, how often horror comedy uses horror tropes shot in full light. And David Naughton's character transformation into, I think that's a Rick Baker effect.
Absolutely.
That is
He won
the
an
Rick
Oscar
Baker.
for it.
Yeah.
Rick Baker, creature creator?
That's
that
right.
Rick Baker?
That's right.
Okay.
And not the plumber in North Hollywood, the creature creator, showing a transformation, a werewolf transformation where he doesn't clutch his chest, then fall behind a sofa, then stand up a little bit more hairy, then walk through a doorway. Then on the other side, he's a little bit more hairy.
But there is, in that transformation, and I love that transformation, and it's a part of me. There's, it's like mostly David Naughton, and they're doing it very artfully. And then at one point in the middle of it, they just cut to a shot of like a figurine of Mickey Mouse, like standing on a shelf. And that's when they cut back. It's the fake David Naughton head with the snout stretching moment. Whereas same year, Rob Bottin, The Howling.
The Howling, okay.
Does with Robert Picardo I think a much better werewolf transformation and with very, very few cuts. And I would argue The Howling is almost as funny as an American Werewolf in London.
I would disagree.
His original cut of that was David Naughton walking behind the stairs or walking down behind the
Like a sofa?
behind the sofa and then coming up as a werewolf, then doing the elevator thing behind the sofa, then coming up as a
Maybe we should
werewolf.
get Rick Baker in. Rick had this idea.
I'm so glad you picked that movie, Jeff. We debated, is it a horror comedy or is it just a really good, scary
Yes.
movie that's super funny?
Yes.
We debated it. I love that movie. It's one of my favorites.
Well,
So.
I think
I love it too. I would argue that it's a horror movie that has funny people in it.
Yeah.
Even John
Hey,
Landis
we
has
we love it too.
Okay.
Don't just let them get all the
I'm
love
saying
for
John
it.
Landis has even said it's not a comedy, it's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And he did make the movie.
Rob Bottin's hand guided the most almost comedic / surreal elements of The Thing, which were
Yeah.
the creature transformations.
Oh my God.
And that movie scared the shit out of me. So it definitely is a horror film with comedic
The Thing?
elements.
I mean,
Yeah.
The Thing, again, to me, well, okay, I'm going to just say, I think horror movies are completely dry if they don't have any humor in them at all.
Yeah.
So The Thing, I would not argue is a horror comedy ever, but it's got some great laugh lines.
Yeah. You gotta be fucking kidding me. His head
Yeah.
sprouts legs and crawls across the floor like a spider. So that's in the bag. And then Ben and Bob, you're up.
All right, it's time for Evil Dead 2,
Oh wow,
which I
amazing.
think any good conversation
Love
about
this
horror
movie.
comedies,
Love it.
you have to bring it up. I saw it in the theater. Did you see it in the theater?
I did see it in the theater. I was too young to see it in the theater, and a friend of mine invited me to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I proceeded to hate. But it was a midnight screening, and me and my friend snuck into and watched Evil Dead 2, which was released unrated. So I was like 15.
Yeah, so Evil. I don't know if I need to pitch the movie. Basically, it's the Evil Dead universe. The original one was super low budget. Then they had a few $1,000,000 for Evil Dead 2, so they, instead of just doing a straight sequel, because I guess they weren't sure whether or not people were going to have seen the original, they did
They couldn't get the rights to any of the original footage, so they had to sort of.
Oh, okay.
Because a different company owned the original Evil Dead, and De Laurentiis made Evil Dead 2.
Got it. Well, they basically then just kind of did a recap 5-minute version of the movie to start it off to catch everybody up. But then they took everything that was in the original movie and just cranked it up, way past 11.
And they also sort of like summarized the first movie in the first 10 minutes of the sequel.
Right. And then so you've got Ash by himself and like pretty much the greatest Cabin in the Woods movie. And it's insanely inventive and scary and bloody, but also just crazy funny, like a Three Stooges level of farce.
Well, that's when they started getting, like, they all were inspired by Three Stooges kind of stuff. Sam Raimi and Robert Tappert and Bruce Campbell and all those guys. And that was when they went all fully Three Stooges on us. Very, very slapstick, but then it's slapstick guided by a horrible, malignant supernatural force that's trying to, kill everybody.
The Three Stooges in this case were Klaatu, Barata, and Nikto.
One thing I saw before I saw Evil Dead 2 was the Charlie Chaplin film The Gold Rush, where he's a master of physical comedy and sight gags, and in The Gold Rush he's trapped in a cabin and he's starving, and there's all these elements that are kind of trying to kill him. And I remember seeing the Evil Dead 2 and feeling like Bruce Campbell was doing Buster Keaton level visual
for sure,
physical comedy, and Charlie Chaplin level kind of, you had an amount of pathos for this guy. So it almost felt like that genre maybe had its a predecessor in silent film. I would say definitely silent film, definitely vaudeville, and those guys were all obsessed with the Three Stooges.
Yeah. So the Three Stooges are clearly inspired by that kind of stuff. I mean, the scene where Bruce Campbell's hand becomes possessed and it attacks him and flips him over and does all these terrible things until he cuts his own hand off.
Yeah.
Oh man, I mean, like that's just one guy doing like 5 minutes of uninterrupted slapstick.
Yeah, yeah, and it does seem, having read Sam Raimi's books, or is it Bruce Campbell's books about the making of the first film and the second, it does seem like there was a directorial mission from Sam Raimi to try to destroy Bruce Campbell or find the limits of his talent.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also the movie where he attaches the chainsaw to his hand with the iconic line, groovy, But the thing is that, to me, genuinely, the movie is very scary. There's moments where, like, you're kind of in the point of view of this evil force that's following them, and it's kind of this creepy ass shot that they do all the time. Or there's many iconic shots of the hand coming out of the ground, or whatever. When his girlfriend, after he chops her up, kind of reforms as a ghost and dances for him. It's pretty chilling, creepy ass stuff. But then after he cuts his hand off and puts it under a bucket, and then tries to find some books to wait at, the top book is A Farewell to Arms. They're making a comedy.
Michael, you'd comment.
Oh, I always like seeing like a director's early work to see how much it influences something that he does later. I know that like a lot of like like something that was a lot bigger, like Spider-Man 2, had these big kind of terror sequences with like his Dr. Octopus character and these arms that were like moving independently, and they kind of had their mind of their own. And when he had like his birth sequence, it felt very much like, oh, I've done this horror movie and now I have $100 million and let's see what I can do. And like a lot of this, like the shots were very, very similar, like a point of view shot where like the arms are chasing after someone, like the chainsaw or the hand shot. And like I love to see a director who starts small but then uses all like the tricks of directing and the tricks of cinematography in a bigger movie, and to see like, oh, his roots came from something that were, he kind of had to do something that's kind of catch as catch can, and like we're working on a limited budget, but when they make it big to see like, oh, now I can really kind of unload and see and go to that next level.
I feel like Darkman is the in between of those films, because he does have these. He's flying from building to building. He has these super heroic type of strengths as a man who can feel no pain. Is that what Darkman?
Yeah, his nerve endings are all damaged, and he can feel no pain. And he's wearing artificial skin that only lasts, I forget, 90 minutes before his face melts off of his creepy-looking, zombie-looking face.
But like Michael said, you do see Sam Raimi playing with bigger toys from a storytelling standpoint, but also taking the restraining bolt off his imagination, because now it's not fettered by a camera that's breaking down in the cold weather.
It's interesting to see like kind of the progression of Sam Raimi, because he goes from like Darkman, and then he did like a Simple Plan. Well, he did. There were steps between Evil Dead and Army of Darkness kind of stuff. Army of Darkness was a pretty reasonably budgeted movie, but he did a Simple Plan. He did The Gift, and then he did Spider-Man. Or maybe I have The Gift and Spider-Man mixed up, but it was around the same time. But it's like I think that he came at it very visually initially, and then became very character centered. And interestingly enough, a friend of mine worked on a project of his recently, and I asked him what it was like, and he said he doesn't even talk. Not that he's not talking to the crew, but like basically he just works with the actors and the cinematographers and camera people already know what to do.
Oh, okay.
And I think that the arc of if I'm to understand this correctly, and I may not, is that like he starts, you can tell, very obsessed with visuals and sequence construction, and I think that he's come to a point where he's mostly concerned about characters and all that stuff, which is it's a more mature approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, guys, what do you got?
Our next film is kind of in that same vein. It's 1992's Dead Alive, also known as Brain Dead.
Oh, yeah.
Peter Jackson movie.
Big
and this
time.
was like before, obviously, before he made it big with Lord of the Rings, or even, what was the kind of smaller?
Frighteners.
The Fartners?
There was another one with the girls.
With Heavenly Creatures.
Heavenly Creatures, thank you. This was his like zombie movie. And this movie is ridiculous. The inception is that someone is bitten on Skull Island, which he'll later revisit. He'll revisit Skull Island again when he did his remake of King Kong, by a Sumatran rat monkey. And then
it's like a little stop motion guy, if I remember.
Yeah, it's so silly. And then this rat monkey gets moved to New Zealand because, of course, and then it bites someone else, and that person happens to be the mother of the main character, Lionel, and he has like this weird relationship with it, like a very kind of abusive relationship with his mom, and he's very doting to her. So she turns into a zombie, but he can't deal with it, so he keeps her in the basement on these drugs, and it's this he keeps this pretense up of keeping his mom alive with drugs, even though it's ridiculous. And that is even before you get to the scene where he's using a full push lawnmower to mow down zombies.
One of the
death.
greatest zombie kills of all time.
It's like
I kick ass for the Lord.
and that scene too, where like they're having a few last season and over the course of the last year, we talked a lot about like 1950s cool. And this movie is set in like 1957, and there's this element of like this rockers versus kind of prep, or rockers versus nerds sort of thing that happens at this house party, where all these kind of thugs, these hoodlums, get turned into zombies, and they start attacking all of these kind of nerds and girls in this house. And we've talked a whole lot about like 1950s cool leather jacket iconography, and I love them turned into zombies. They're like they're the punk rockers of the 80s.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Because all you need to do is put a leather jacket on a zombie, and suddenly he's cool and eating your face.
So I've never seen this. I've never heard of it.
That's amazing.
It's insane. It's a really good movie.
Because it goes from like this. It's kind of this weird kind of psychological thing for this main character Lionel, where he's
It doesn't stop being that, though.
Yeah.
It gets pretty Oedipal at the end.
really like. There's zombies that are having sex, and there's a weird. Then the mom grows. It's like it's literally all over the place, but it's so. You see like these elements that he does with like his shot selection, Peter Jackson, that you can see later on in The Lord of the Rings. Like he has like these pan zooms that I think he does also in Lord of the Rings, and like to see a clever director, like we were talking about with Sam Raimi, move from I only have a couple $100,000 to make this movie to I have $300 million to make this epic, but use some of those tricks I think is interesting. And the movie is just funny. Like Ben, you mentioned the I kick ass for the lore sequence. There's a bit where out of nowhere, they're like in a graveyard and these kind of zombies are attacking. And then the priest like appears on the top of a tomb and jumps down and he starts like kung fu fighting these zombies.
It's pretty.
And he's like this white-haired priest, and it's so unexpected, and you're just like, what is this thing?
So many fresh choices. That's the thing. Is like it feels like a guy who's seen Evil Dead. He's seen all the Romero movies, and he's like, you know what? I'm not gonna repeat any of that stuff. I'm gonna all fresh new choices. Why not have kung fu priest kicking zombies? He doesn't even live like that. If you had that character today, that character would make it to the end because that'd be a fan favorite. Doesn't he? Die like right
in that
after
scene, like
yeah,
in a minute
scene,
and a
okay.
half. And later on, there's like the main character Lionel is like this real wimpy. Like that's the arc of the characters. He's like this downtrodden wimpy. His mom's like abusing him and treats him like garbage and doesn't want him to date anyone. And it's him trying to protect her, and then he has to come out of that shadow and turn into this ass kicker who's chopping up zombies and just cutting people's arms off and doing all the things that the hero should do, but he has to get to the point where he almost looks like the zombie himself. He's covered in blood.
Cartoonishly bloody.
It's a lot in the line with Evil Dead 2.
Which is interesting because that's a lot of... This is like this delineating line, right, of Peter Jackson films. You've got the Bad Taste, which was basically like this thing he made in his backyard with his
love
friends.
that movie so much.
You got Meet the Feebles, which is
It's the most disgusting thing I've ever seen.
Meet the Feebles is so transgressive.
Right.
Like it's like Peter Jackson is a different filmmaker today than the guy who made Meet the Feebles, and I want the Meet the Feebles guy back.
Then you've got this, and then you've got Heavenly Creatures, which is like just 100% total shift. And so it's interesting that this is like the last movie he made that was really like in his splatter gore comedy sort of phase, and then from there he goes to this like psychological drama about two teenage girls who end up becoming killers.
I love the discussion of career and where horror or horror comedy might fit in that lineage for a director. Were horror to be considered a B genre until the movie Psycho, or until it kind of broke out of it, would you say it's a good low budget school for filmmakers, and or has traditionally been?
Hell yeah. I mean, when you look at most filmmakers, scroll down to the beginning of even look at Spielberg. What's his first movie? Duel. Duel is kind of a horror movie, and then his first blockbuster is Jaws, which you could argue isn't a horror movie, but I'd argue that it relies on the engine of a horror movie.
Yeah. Both horror and comedy separately are genres that you can do a lot with a little. So like comedy, you just need really funny people. You need great writing. Horror, it's like you can have a lot of resources, but also like you look at films like Night of the Living Dead and in Evil Dead, you can do a lot with almost nothing. And so I think genre films that directors tackle earlier in their career, it's them learning to tell bigger stories with almost no resources. And I think that's why a lot of these filmmakers have gone on to, I think, really incredible careers, because in the beginning they were forced to like learn how to do it with nothing.
Another element that I would bring up too is that like those kinds of genre movies don't require giant stars to get either made or to find, like no one in America knew who Simon Pegg was when Shaun of the Dead came out, but that movie was a reasonably good hit, and it's because it was great. And in fact, sometimes having a huge cast, like I'm thinking of the 1999 remake of The Haunting with Liam Neeson and Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Oh yeah.
Like it doesn't work, because it's like you walk in with all these preconceived ideas about Liam Neeson and Catherine Zeta-Jones, et cetera, and so to me, like it's better if I don't know who anyone in the cast is. When the first time you saw The Evil Dead 2, even you probably had no idea who Bruce Campbell was. So you don't walk in with a set of ideas so they can build a new thing for you for the first time. And comedy is the same way. When you see an inspired comedy, when you see something like The Foot Fist Way, you don't know who Danny McBride is, but suddenly here's this guy doing a thing you've never seen before.
Yeah.
And that's like, I think almost like, to get back to Peter Jackson, The Frighteners was like that in a sense. I think a lot of people went into it thinking it was going to be Marty McFly as a horror film, and
it went against the myth of Michael J. Fox, and it tried to recast Michael J. Fox as a different kind of person, and I think that worked in its favor and also against it a little bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of critics at least went into it expecting that, and when they didn't get that, it didn't match like their expectations. And I think that's why at the time it was kind of considered to be a failure.
So when you're describing one of the more comical aspects of Dead Alive as a preacher doing kung fu, is that right? It made me think of how other people who are so closely associated with the genre, such as martial arts, Jackie Chan, I think of Stephen Chow, or am I getting that name correctly? Correct.
Who's the fat guy?
Who's the fat guy? Yeah, Stephen Chow in Kung Fu Hustle.
There we go.
Using comedic elements to rise above your typical martial arts film. So
Yeah.
there's another genre that's has as rife opportunity to make people laugh or to do something novel like Jackie Chan does in almost every fight he does.
But I mean, there really is only one Jackie Chan, and I think it's because when you're someone who can blend two genres that well, there really aren't. Most people are lucky if they can think straight in one genre, but to be able to kind of somehow juggle both all the elements of a horror and a comedy, or in that case of a comedy and kung fu, it's like, why couldn't that work together? But Jackie Chan's the guy who does that the way he does it.
Well, Mankel's also describing the hero's journey as it applies to these stories too. It's an individual who's just beaten down for the first half of the movie, and then devises a plan or an ensemble of people to help him rise above that stuff. Those plot lines don't diverge; they're convergent for a lot of these genres. So,
Sammo Hung, that's the fat guy.
Sammo Hung, the big guy
from martial law. Just want to make sure we got that out there. Didn't want to confuse people.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Bob and Ben, what do you got?
Our last one is 2012's Cabin in the Woods, which was directed by Drew Goddard, he's known mostly for television directing, but it was written by Joss Whedon. And
They actually wrote it together in
and-
3 days, supposedly.
wow,
Yeah.
talk about some Coke-fueled writing. I know I'm the only person in the room who would ever say this out loud. I don't really like Joss Whedon's work. This is the one thing he ever did that just blew my mind. And it was in the way that he kind of, in the way that this movie decodes movies like Evil Dead, but there's a zillion movies like that where it's a bunch of teenagers go to a cabin in the woods, and they take such a different take on that, and kind of pull apart the tropes similarly to how Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven did with Scream in the 90s. And to me, it is also fucking hilarious. Like it's got but it also is really scary. Like they figured out kind of a story engine, is that the word? Whereby, like you could have like this cadre of monsters that are kept in this weird fortress, and it's like all part of this ritual. So the monsters are all real, and the people are kind of just like corporate drones.
Yeah, the workaday life of the white collar workers who populate that environment that's controlling, like puppet masters, the world that these young teenagers are pulled into.
But it's also like that could have been like a reveal much later in the film about even seeing any of that under the ground stuff, and they start there. It's like a workplace comedy, literally beneath a traditional cabin in the woods horror movie.
Yeah.
And the way they blend those two and use it to kind of, like Ben said, decode, that trope in general, I think is genius.
I think it also has elements of the Bond henchman sort of idea.
Oh yeah.
Like, what if the henchmen were actually just kind of blue collar guys?
Right.
Almost like Homer Simpson working for Hank Scorpio, that sort of thing.
Yeah, they could be the Bradley Whitford and Richard Jenkins characters could be the guys who run a chicken disemboweling factory.
Exactly.
And they're the white collar guys just kind of looking at spreadsheets while this nightmarish
But like when the movie
bloodletting happens.
started, like I remember like having a moment of like, did I go into the wrong movie? Because I thought I was in for a Cabin in the Woods movie, and it starts in kind of this underground bunker in there in like a golf cart driving around or whatever, and it's so brilliantly blends all that, and there's also a great scene where they're like ideating different ways that the stuff can go, and they've got a big whiteboard and it's got all these different things,
and they're betting on it.
Which one's going to be the one, and I think Bradley Whitford was the one that was all excited about a merman, about mermen being, and then at the end he ends up getting a spoiler alert. Killed by a merman, and it's like moments of just supreme irony. That I don't know. I just think we almost picked Scream because Scream is also a great horror comedy that kind of plays on the tropes of the genre. But in a lot of ways, I think this. I don't know. This does it in a different way that I found really unexpected when I saw it.
I think these type of movies, the state of mind that you're in when you sit down to watch it makes a big difference in terms of how much you like it or how successful you think it is. I remember watching Zombievers not too long ago.
Didn't make it through it.
Well, you didn't?
No, I watched like 20 minutes of it.
Now you see, I think if I would have been sitting by myself or just kind of like just
Did
sort
you
of
read the
watching on
book
my
and
own-
you're like, oh, this is not like the book?
They totally went off the.
Right. I think that's a Jane Austen
Jane
book,
Austen's
right?
Zombiever.
Yeah. But I was sitting there watching it with like a big group of friends. We were like half drunk at that point. And it was just like one of those communal sort of like just watching the movie and sort of like seeing how ridiculous everything was. And I think that made the movie work for me in a way. And you guys talked about that with some of the other movies as well. I think, it ties in this idea. When you see something like Cabin in the Woods, everyone kind of can take something from it. Maybe you haven't seen every film that this is sort of referencing, right? But this person has seen some of it. You go, oh yeah, I remember that from this. And it kind of becomes more of a communal experience.
Through your experience and love for horror, you've become familiar with the tropes and the beats, and you got laughs from Cabin in the Woods, seeing how it fulfilled or distracted you or fulfilled expectations or misdirected you from what those were. And my wife just saw it as a horror movie. It was too scary to be a comedy.
Really?
And she's not familiar with those beats.
Oh.
So if she were to see Evil Dead, she would just see it as a horror movie. She might wonder why it's so cartoonish. But I do wonder, is this a hipster genre where you're patting yourself on the back for getting it? Like, oh, they always do this. If she saw Shaun of the Dead, she would just think it was scary. She wouldn't think.
Does she have a medical condition of some sort? Some sort of like
I think
aphasia or something?
I think you may be right about this. I mean, like there's kind of the meta comment on the genre thing, which is what Scream is as well. So I think that maybe you could kind of put the label of hipsterism on something like this because it's clearly created by people who love this genre but have also dissected it completely. And they're like, oh, there has to be a gas station with a creepy old person who gives the main characters a dire warning, blah, blah, blah. You know, there are these tropes that you just hit on every goddamn one of these. And, you know, even though they all do them differently, you know, like in Evil Dead, there isn't the creepy old guy, but there's the ricketiest bridge in the history of bridges that they drive over that should serve as some kind of a warning. Like it's all in there. I don't think that I don't think Evil Dead or Shaun of the Dead are meta necessarily though. I mean, Cabin in the Woods by definition is a very meta idea, you know?
Okay. It looks like there's one choice to be made.
All
Gentlemen.
right, so last one, and this is one that I will readily admit this is definitely on the comedy side of the comedy horror genre. Perhaps the ultimate satire, Young Frankenstein.
Oh, okay. Fun.
I didn't realize they actually used a lot of the lab sets from the original 1931
The Tesla
Universal Horror.
coils
Yeah,
and
all that sort of stuff
yeah,
was props from the original movie, which just I think goes to show the level of detail that went into making this movie. And I can talk about all the backstory and all that, but it's Young Frankenstein is one of the funniest damned movies ever made. And again, I think this ties into it's the same thing maybe as Shaun of the Dead. You know that like Mel Brooks loved those Universal horror films.
Yeah.
Or else he wouldn't have been able to make something like this.
Does it not emerge from, I think Gene Wilder is the guy who pitched the idea, who wrote the screenplay. He has a credit on the screenplay. And one thing that I think sells this film is Gene Wilder, throughout his earlier career, was this, and I think Gene Wilder functioned so well in comedy because ultimately he was a dramatic actor who was just so hilarious when pushed to his wit's end.
Oh, same thing with Peter Boyle. I mean, Peter Boyle was like a heavy, serious actor.
Yeah.
Before he started doing stuff like this. So I think you have to be able to, it's best comedy is played straight.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same thing with horror films as well. You can't be winking at the audience when you do something like this. I think it just totally shatters any sort of world building that you're trying to do. And I think it's the same thing here.
That's interesting because I think they do that quite a bit. I think that the Marty Feldman character is kind of winking to the camera quite a bit. And I think that even Peter Boyle especially
Well, at the end, yes.
Well, with Marty Feldman, it's hard to tell if he's winking at you or winking at you.
Fair enough.
I think this is when we wanted to talk about a classic horror movie, but we weren't sure which way to go. We talked about like the Abbott and Costello thing, and like it must have been strange to make a movie like the Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein when like there was a generation that was the Universal monster movies were things that came out pretty recently. This is something that you had to call back to, especially in the tone of it. I don't know how far into it that they decided to make it black and white, which I thought I think that was the move that kind of made the movie. If this movie was in color, it would be just like another comedy. But I think that since they were able to pull in kind of like that Universal Hammer sort of like, overly saturated blacks and, they could film the monster looking monstrous.
Yeah.
Versus just him like with green skin, it would have been. I think that was such the smartest moment to make it a horror movie, and like this is what this is. It calls back to that, but then it's
you immediately
bonkers.
get the visuals of it.
Yeah.
And actually, the studio, according to Mel Brooks, wanted to make it They told him, well, you can shoot it in black and white, but we also want to do a color version. Because in Peru, they just got color film, so we want to be able to market that. And he's like, no, I know what you're going to do. You're going to say at the last minute, oh, we have to release the color version because X, Y, Z. And he told him to go pound salt.
Yeah.
A lot of these directors seem to have so much of a, with Blazing Saddles, that has a huge history of Westerns built into it and tropes of that. Like, it's interesting that so many of these directors and creators have like been able to take from the past and to build on something that is very fresh, like Cabin in the Woods, just a new idea based on all these other ideas that you're just like, I've never seen that before. And I think that even though you've seen Frankenstein before or any of the Dracula movies, you see those elements in Young Frankenstein, but it also feels like something different.
Well, I think the difference between parody and, I use the word satire, but just they're honoring those movies. It's like, we're going to make this funny, but we're not making fun of it. We're not just pulling the tropes and making jokes out of it like a lot of those, like the scary movies kind of movies do.
It's an homage.
It's an homage. That's the word. Perfect word. Because like also those Universal movies, they started really slow. They took their time getting to any monsters. So does Young Frankenstein. It plays with all the structural and the sound tropes that those movies use.
And that was kind of the shame of like Mel Brooks' later career, like where it went directly into parody. And like Dracula Dead and Loving It, like why didn't you release that as a black and white film or make more of an effort to? I've never seen it. I assume it's terrible.
It's not great.
But like, it's interesting to see that he had kind of reached the perfection with it in the 70s, and then it just kind of went.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, what happened with Mel Brooks? I think that the Zucker films kind of screwed with him because I think after those the Airplanes and the Naked Guns started coming out, he felt like he had to make everything a joke a minute. Versus, like you said, with with Young Frankenstein, it kind of mimics that sort of feel of the original films. And if you look at Young Frankenstein, there's not a gag every minute. The gags that land really hard. And I think Mel Brooks eventually kind of got to that point where he felt like he had to be like, just throw as much shtick onto the wall and see what stuck.
I think sometimes the business changes around a filmmaker and what Hollywood expects and what audiences expect. And then they're kind of like, well, I was doing it a certain way. And I mean, some filmmakers never change with the. I think Quentin Tarantino is just going to always make his movie. He doesn't care. But I think you're right. I think Mel Brooks he's been around for so many decades. Then all of a sudden he woke up one day and the business of those kinds of comedies, it just changed.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's the stature of the genre and the stature of film had also kind of I don't say lowered itself, but broadened. There's so many film as a medium had aged. There's just so many diverse genres and versions and variants of those genres that it seemed like there's not that much. If the core of satire is taking something from a high level and bringing it down, the work had already been done for him. When I think of Young Frankenstein, coming out in 74 on IMDb at least. Blazing Saddles is also listed as 74. So
The number 1 and number 3 films of that year.
is that right?
Wow.
Yeah. So I think
Pretty good year.
In as much as I
Brooks.
really don't look at Blazing Saddles, and it doesn't kind of walks like a Western and talks like a Western, but there's never a point where I think I'm watching a Western. I feel like I'm watching kind of an extended SNL sketch. And there's characters and archetypes that we know Brooks is winking at, but it uses the genre to its benefit whenever it feels like it, and just kind of dispenses
It's
it.
a broader film, but I also do think they went to great pains to make it look like an old Technicolor
Yeah,
Western.
it does have a big CinemaScope kind of
Yeah.
forward kind of feel to
Yeah,
it.
same thing with High Anxiety, which is the kind of
gonna
forgotten
bring that
Mel
up.
Brooks film
Yeah.
where it very much looks like it's a Hitchcock film, even though, except when they, like you said, when they don't need it to.
Well, those are fun choices. So any closing arguments?
No.
I'm surprised nobody mentioned Scream. I'm surprised that Scream didn't make the cut.
I'm amazed that we put up totally different choices.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare that, usually an argument between Richard and I will have some sort of,
At least one pick that's
yeah.
shared.
It's been interesting to look at the genre and see just how vast it is, and see how many movies are qualified
Yeah.
to be considered. Yeah.
And if I can bring up one crazy deep cut we were just talking about earlier, we had a deep cut that I'd never even seen that you pitched. Turned out Richard pitched the same movie. It's Man Bites Dog.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, and
Which
we
is great that
yeah.
both you guys were fighting, and both Michael and I were like, what movie?
I think we shot it down for the same reason, which was just like, I don't know.
Michael, I believe, what did you say? It was like the Richard freshman year of college starts watching a lot of movies.
Yeah.
And
At 3
runs
a.m.
into it. Yeah. That's pretty much
You
what
were
happened with
Ben
that.
when we had that conversation,
Yes.
but I was like, Ben was making the same argument, just like, it's hilarious. I'm like, really?
It is, but it's also super scary and I love Man Bites Dog. I think it's a great
The one that you pushed for that we didn't get to, now that I guess we're doing the Criterion
Shoulda,
edition.
woulda, coulda,
Yeah. You really wanted Arachnophobia, or not wanted, but that's one that we kicked around a bit. I
You
think
just
it's an
mentioned
underrated
two
one.
movies in a row that I had to stop because they just gave me the heebie-jeebies. Man Bites Dog, when watching on a home video, I had
Wow.
to stop it because
It's disturbing.
And then I left the theater for Arachnophobia.
What?
Do you have spider issues, or?
Oh yeah.
Oh, you shouldn't tell me that.
No, I'm afraid of John Goodman.
The Big Lebowski, worst horror comedy ever.
That's not a bad fear to have. That's just common sense, Jeff.
Why did you pick Arachnophobia?
Why didn't we?
Why
Or-
didn't you?
I don't know. I think
Just fell off the list.
I think because I think we were at the time we were still in the category thing, and it was an animal creature one, and I
Yeah.
think we just like Gremlins a little bit more.
Okay.
I kind of tried to do a soft push for Piranha, but I got shot down on that one pretty quick.
Well, is there anything that your audience for 20 Seconds to Live has taught you about the productions you were been saying that you choose kind of, does one or everybody die? Was that one?
There's only one episode where almost everybody dies all at once. I'll let the audience. You can binge every single episode we ever did in about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So-
Well, unlike, probably when George Romero sat down to do a zombie film, there's nobody typing in comments at the bottom or thumbs upping or thumbs downing. There's people in the audience giving reactions. But was there something that your audience exclaimed about it, or were there people looking for comedy who got too scared, or people looking for horror? Who...
I don't think any of our episodes are there are some. One of our friends showed our first episode to like a famous TV star who looked at and got so grossed out. She was like, "Why would you ever show me that?" And it was like the one episode where a face
Betty White.
where a face gets cut off. And,
Yeah, it ends super gross. It is by far the grossest one of the first season.
And honestly, there's only a couple. We try not. We have some gross out episodes, but not too many. I think what we learned pretty quickly is our audience is game for it. Like they want to try to figure who's going to die, how. They want to be surprised. And so when we're constructing episodes, we're always like, how can we honor that desire and make our episodes surprising while still fitting the structure of the show. And I think to our credit, like we'll release a new episode and people are like, I never saw that coming. And like if we can be hopefully one step ahead of our audience, then we know we've made a good episode.
And I think if we're thinking in our own selves, like, what would I expect to happen right now, and then subvert that somehow, or make it not pan out exactly the way that it would. And our producer on both seasons is a woman named Kat Pasiak, and a lot of times she would throw in. She's not as much of a diehard fan of the genre stuff as we are, but she would throw in ideas that would sometimes be like, "Oh my God, that had never occurred to me," because we're both kind of like in a lane, like
steeped in the horror.
Yeah, and so to have an outside opinion kind of throw us for a loop was always fun too.
I think if you think about all the movies we talked about, I mean, they're all examples of filmmakers going, here's the tried and true way to do this. What's the fun choice? What's the fresh, different thing to do? I think that's kind of like a through line in all these movies we've been talking about, and that's what we try to do in our show.
Well, thanks for making great horror comedy, and thanks for joining us today on the Mount Rushmore podcast of horror comedy. Now I have the difficult challenge of ranking. Now I have the normally difficult challenge of finding a winner.
This is the point where we get screwed. Spoiler alert, Michael.
Very often when guests come take on Richard and Michael as competitors, I, out of kindness, award them more points than Richard and Michael, but there's no kindness. You guys just did better. So I would like to acknowledge your choices, your cabin choices. Evil Dead 2 and Cabin in the Woods, two things that I agree with and enjoyed very much in the genre of horror comedy. So you'd each get a point for that, Evil Dead 2 and Cabin in the Woods. And for Michael and Richard, I don't think you can have this conversation today without bringing up Shaun of the Dead and how much it has given to the world of horror comedy and to the world of last-minute Halloween costume choices. So
you got a lot of cricket bats around here?
Oh my God, I'm rifle. I do have a rubber axe over there. And the creative choice of, I also I always think of this. I really realize it's not as a kids genre, but but Gremlins. That was a fun pick too. But just because you're the guest and I like you guys to win, I'm also going to choose Re-Animator. So there's an extra head, as there should be, on the Mount Rushmore horror.
So it's like the band with two heads.
Yeah, it's the man.
Nice.
Rosie
basically.
Greer is.
We could just have like the George Washington holding his head can be severed and he can be holding his head.
Yes, perfect.
Giving cunnilingus to Martha Washington. Good job, everyone.
For all our newly inaugurated fans of 20 Seconds to Live, when can they expect season 2 to drop?
Well, we're playing the Vancouver Web Festival, which is a massive and super cool web festival in Vancouver. We're playing that next week. So if you would like to go see our episodes live with an audience, which is how we recommend horror comedies be seen,
fly to Vancouver.
Please go to Vancouver and see our show. And then hopefully episodes will actually be online either right before or right after. Mm-hmm. And go to 20secondstolive.com for more information.
And you had some fans who kind of helped act as producers of your second season.
Well, we did an Indiegogo campaign, and we raised a modest sum of money.
Oh, okay,
enough money to shoot 4 episodes. So we're thankful to everybody who helped us make this a reality.
Yeah. It was the first season was completely out of our own pockets, and the second season was, how it goes. You run out of favors, so you have to start paying people a little bit of something.
Well, cool. I'm glad you're getting the support that you deserve for it. So this has been Mount Rushmore Podcast. I, as always, am Jeff.
I'm Richard.
I'm Michael.
I'm Ben.
Hey, I'm Bob.